Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You know, there are certain moments in life that don't just hurt, they burn themselves into your bones so deep, you swear you'll feel them even after you're dead. That moment for me came in the form of my sister's smug little smile as she slipped her hand into mine and said, "You deserve better, Jules." Maybe it just wasn't meant to be. And the thing is, I believed her for a moment. I actually stood there in my own damn engagement party with the scent of white roses and champagne still in the air and thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe the sideways glances between her and Daniel were just me being insecure. But gut instincts aren't just whispers, they're sirens. And I should have listened sooner. But let me rewind, because to understand the betrayal, you have to understand the history. Vanessa and I were born 3 years apart. Me first, her second, though you'd never know it by the way she strutted around like the universe owed her center stage. She was the golden child, shiny, loud, effortlessly charming in that exhausting way some people are. The kind of girl who didn't need to try because someone else was always handing her the prize. Meanwhile, I was the quieter one, the bookworm, the planner, the fixer. I was the one who got straight A's while she snuck out with boys who drove muscle cars and smelled like Marlboro Reds and bad intentions. Still, I loved her. God help me, I did. I loved her with that dumb kind of sister love that makes you blind to the knife she's been holding behind her back since high school. The kind of love that made me invite her into every part of my life, even the parts she had no business touching. So when I met Daniel, I wasn't just falling in love, I was already picturing him sitting across the Thanksgiving table, next to my sister, laughing about childhood stories while my mom passed the mashed potatoes. Daniel was the kind of man who made you feel like the world had finally handed you a winning ticket. Tall, sharp jawline, eyes like early morning smoke, and a voice that made you forget your own name if you weren't careful. He had money, real money, old family money, not that new flashy kind that screams insecurity. But more than that, he made me feel seen. He asked questions, remembered details, made me feel like I was something rare, something worth keeping. Our engagement happened 6 months in. It wasn't rushed, not by our standards. We clicked like a goddamn puzzle, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was ahead of my sister, just by a few steps. Vanessa didn't say much when I showed her the ring, just a tight-lipped smile and one of those half-hugs she gives when she's pretending to be happy for you. I should have known right then. I should have seen the crack behind her teeth. But I didn't. I let her close again. She offered to help plan the wedding. Said she had ideas for the reception, knew the best caterers, even helped me pick the dress. And I, like a fool, let her. I mistook proximity for support. I thought maybe this was her turning a corner, finally stepping into her role as my sister, not my rival. Turns out, she was just getting a better view before she shoved the knife in. I found out 2 months before the wedding. A text of all things, a goddamn text on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't even meant for me. It was from Daniel, but sent accidentally to me instead of her. I still remember it word for word. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same hotel? I stared at the screen like it was a foreign language, my brain refusing to connect the dots. And when I called him, voice trembling like I'd just swallowed broken glass, he lied. Of course he did. Said it was a client. Said I was being paranoid. Said I was acting crazy. But then came the voicemail. A pocket dial, maybe. Or karma finally pulling her weight. I heard her voice. Vanessa's voice. Soft, low, sultry, saying things I won't repeat because they still make me nauseous. My sister. In bed with my fiancé. Laughing like they'd won something. Like I was some stupid, naive obstacle they'd outsmarted. I didn't confront her right away. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't throw anything, not even when I found out my parents already knew. That's right, my own damn parents knew and didn't tell me. Said they didn't want to get involved in young people's drama. Said maybe it was for the best, maybe Daniel wasn't the one after all. And then came the kicker, they invited him to Sunday dinner like nothing happened. He sat at our table, sipping wine while my sister rubbed his arm and smiled like a goddamn Disney villain. And I sat there, silent, every nerve in my body on fire. That's when something inside me snapped. Not broken, no, not broken. Something sharper. Something colder. I excused myself halfway through dessert, walked outside into the freezing night, and stood there under the porch light while the wind tore through me. That was the last time I ever cried over them. That was the moment I made a promise, to myself, to whatever higher power was still listening, to every woman who's ever been blindsided by someone she trusted, that this wouldn't be the end of my story. They thought they won. They thought I'd vanish into the background, just another forgotten heartbreak in the family album. But what they didn't know was, I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. 15 years have a way of stretching and twisting your memories until they barely resemble the truth, like old photographs left too long in the sun, the edges curling, the colors bleeding into something vague and bittersweet. I hadn't stepped foot in my hometown since the day I walked away from that dinner table with tears still burning the back of my throat and rage coiled so tight in my chest I thought it might split me open. But when the call came that my mother had passed, I didn't even hesitate. Not because of guilt, not because of grief, but because something in me needed to see it all one last time. The old house, the faces, the lies still sitting heavy in the walls like dust that never quite gets cleaned. The town hadn't changed much, still that same lazy sprawl of outdated boutiques, coffee shops with overbrewed coffee, and neighbors who knew too much about everybody else's business. The funeral was held at the same Baptist church my mother dragged us to every Sunday growing up, the kind of place with hard pews, hollow prayers, and the smell of floor polish so strong it felt like grief was being sanitized out of the air. I wore black, obviously, but not for tradition. It just felt appropriate to match the ashes I carried inside me. When I stepped into the church, every head turned. Not in some grand, cinematic way, but in that slow, passive-aggressive glance you only get from people who've spent years talking behind your back and suddenly have to face you in person. I could almost hear the whispers before they started. Is that Julia? She looks older, doesn't she? Did she ever get married? I heard she moved out west, started a business or something, who knows. And then came Vanessa. Of course, she had to make an entrance like she was walking a red carpet instead of attending our mother's funeral. She waltzed in wearing a designer coat that probably cost more than my first car, hair perfectly styled, lips puffed and glossed, and just the right amount of tears in her eyes, the kind that say, "Look how beautifully I mourn." Daniel walked a step behind her, still tall, still smug, still with that smirk like he thought the world owed him applause just for showing up. They didn't notice me at first. Or maybe they did and just pretended not to. But when Vanessa finally turned and locked eyes with me, I saw it, the flicker of surprise, the quick scan from head to toe, the little twitch in the corner of her mouth as if to say, still playing dress-up in our old life. Huh? She pulled Daniel closer, looped her arm through his, and walked over like she'd been waiting years for this moment. "You came," she said, her voice dripping with fake warmth, the kind you reserve for polite enemies and nosy neighbors. "I didn't think you'd show up. I mean, it's been what? How many years now?" I smiled, that small, sharp kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. 15, I said simply. "Well," she said, glancing around the room, "you haven't missed much. Same old town. Same old people. Except, of course, things have changed for us." She motioned toward Daniel, who offered me a half-nod like he was some goddamn celebrity greeting a fan at a book signing. "Oh, I can see that," I replied, keeping my voice level, my smile polite, my pulse steady despite the fire crawling just beneath my skin. "We've been busy," Vanessa added, in that breathy voice she uses when she's trying to sound humble but really just wants to gloat. 2 kids, a new house, Daniel's business is doing even better than we hoped. Life's been, well, pretty wonderful. I nodded slowly, letting her words wash over me like a wave I didn't care to fight. She wanted a reaction, needed it, in fact. But I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. Not today. "And you?" she asked, eyes narrowing just enough to give away the intention behind the question. "Still, single." The pause before the word was so deliberate, it was practically a slap in the face. "I mean, nothing wrong with that. Some women just Choose freedom, right? That's when I saw it, that glint in her eye, that little flicker of triumph she couldn't hide. She'd been waiting years for this moment, this single exchange, just so she could remind me that in her story, she thought she'd won. She thought her life was proof that everything she took from me was worth it. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or throw some bitter retort into the air like a wounded teenager. Instead, I tilted my head slightly, smiled again, that same razor-edged smile that says you're holding back something that could ruin someone if you wanted to. Actually, I said calmly, watching her expression shift ever so slightly, my husband's coming too. Her smile faltered, just a twitch, just enough to show that she hadn't expected that. Not in the slightest. "Oh," she said, and for a second, her voice didn't match the confidence in her eyes. "Really? I didn't know you were married." I let the silence hang in the air, heavy and slow, just long enough to let it settle into her bones. "Well," I said, still smiling, still composed, "there's a lot you don't know." And then I turned away, letting her choke on her own curiosity, letting her sit with that itch that would gnaw at her for the rest of the service. She didn't know who he was, didn't know when it happened, didn't know how, and that was the point. Ever had someone mock your life choices while smiling through their plastic surgery face? Ever wanted to scream your truth in a room full of people who only see your scars but not your strength? Ever felt like maybe your silence was the loudest thing in the room? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Because this story, it's just getting started. There's a particular kind of silence that comes after betrayal, a silence that doesn't comfort you, doesn't soothe you, but instead sits heavy on your chest like a weight you can't push off. After the whole world I thought I'd built crumbled in a matter of days, after Daniel and Vanessa tore through my life like a storm that didn't leave anything standing, I didn't scream, and I didn't fall apart the way they probably expected me to. No, I packed a single suitcase, walked away from everything I knew, and disappeared without a goodbye. Not out of weakness, not out of shame, but because I knew that if I stayed, I'd either lose what was left of my soul or set fire to everything around me. And either way, I'd be the one blamed for the ashes. I left town like a ghost slipping out of its own haunted house, boarded a one-way flight to a city where no one knew my name, and started over with nothing but a pair of heels, a chipped phone, and rage in my bloodstream thick enough to keep me going through the coldest nights. I didn't have a plan at first, just an ache in my chest and a promise to myself that I would never let anyone reduce me to background noise again. I worked 2 jobs at first, one at a late-night diner that reeked of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke, the other at a dog grooming place where my hands bled from brushing out matted fur, but I kept my mouth shut and my eyes forward. I wasn't there to complain. I was there to climb. It didn't happen overnight, but brick by brick, I built something for myself. I learned how to code, then started freelancing, then landed a gig with a mid-sized tech startup that was too broke to pay well, but smart enough to recognize talent. Within 3 years, I'd launched my own consultancy, and by year 5, I was negotiating contracts with companies that used to laugh me out of their reception desks. I didn't talk about it to anyone back home. I didn't post about it online. I didn't send Christmas cards or RSVP to family weddings. I didn't even answer my father's voicemails when he started calling out of nowhere, probably because Vanessa was finally too bored with her perfect life to play the dutiful daughter anymore. And through it all, there was him, Jack. I met him at a conference in Chicago, one of those dreary 3-day events with overpriced hotel buffets and corporate buzzwords thrown around like confetti. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. But he looked at people like he saw straight through the noise, and when he looked at me, I felt like he saw everything I'd spent years hiding. We didn't fall in love in some fairy tale montage. We got drunk in a bar, argued about the future of automation, and ended up talking until sunrise about everything except our scars. And that's what made it different. He didn't want to fix me or pity me or pretend my pain didn't matter. He just stayed. Quietly, steadily, without asking for proof of who I used to be. We kept things quiet, deliberately so. I'd learned enough by then to know that happiness doesn't need an audience. Vanessa was still lurking online, liking my occasional business posts, leaving hollow comments like, "So proud of you," under photos of my work trips. But I never posted anything personal, no relationship updates, no couple selfies, nothing to hint at the life I'd built when no one was watching. Let her think I was still out there grinding alone. Let her believe she was still the one who won. That's the thing about people like Vanessa. They only understand success if it's wrapped in gold and flashed around like a prize. They don't recognize quiet power, subtle victories, or the kind of confidence that doesn't need to be paraded. And I knew that when the moment came, when I finally let her see the life I'd made, it would hit harder than any revenge speech or throne drink ever could. Because Jack wasn't just successful, he was powerful in ways Vanessa couldn't comprehend. He wasn't some trophy husband or background player. He was a force, a strategist, a man who could command a room without raising his voice, and, more importantly, he had a past that would make Vanessa's blood run cold. But I'll get to that later. For now, all that mattered was that the funeral service was nearing its end. The air was thick with incense and awkward conversations, and I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that he was about to walk through those doors. And when he did, when he stepped into that church with his black coat still dusted from the cold, eyes scanning the room until they landed on mine, I swear you could feel the air freeze. Not just pause, not just quiet, but freeze in that strange, electric way that happens when something big shifts in the atmosphere and everyone can sense it but can't name it yet. Vanessa turned, just a second too late, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw fear flicker across her face. Not confusion, not irritation, fear. Real, deep, gut-level fear. And that was just the beginning. There are certain moments in life where time doesn't slow down. It simply stops, cold and sharp like the snap of ice under your foot, right before it breaks and swallows you whole. That was exactly the kind of silence that filled the room when Jack stepped through the church doors, shoulders squared, coat still heavy with winter's breath, and that look in his eyes, calm, calculated, and unmistakably dominant. Not the kind of man who walked into a room hoping to be noticed, but the kind of man whose presence made everyone instinctively stand straighter without even knowing why. Conversations tapered off mid-sentence, heads turned subtly, even the pastor paused for a beat too long before pretending he hadn't just lost his train of thought. I didn't need to look at Vanessa to know what her face looked like in that moment. I could feel it. That tension, that nervous inhale, the way she instinctively clutched Daniel's arm just a little tighter, like she needed to steady herself against something solid while the ground beneath her shifted. But I looked anyway, just to witness the way her expression cracked, just to see the way her confident little smirk evaporated like steam off hot pavement. Her eyes flicked between Jack and me, her lips parted slightly, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Vanessa had no words. And that alone was worth every year I'd spent building my silence. Jack walked toward me slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world and no one else in the room mattered. He didn't rush, didn't look at anyone else, just kept his eyes locked on me like we were the only two people in the church. When he reached me, he leaned down, pressed a kiss to my cheek, and said softly but clearly enough for a few nearby ears to catch, "Sorry I'm late, sweetheart." Traffic was a nightmare. Sweetheart, not baby, not honey, not darling, but sweetheart, delivered in that deep, rich voice of his that could charm a courtroom or kill a deal, depending on his mood. I turned toward him, rested my hand on his arm, and smiled the kind of smile that was both a greeting and a message. Let them wonder. Let them squirm. Let the questions simmer beneath the surface until they couldn't hold them back anymore. And they didn't have to wait long. Daniel's reaction came fast and sharp, a stiffening in his spine, a flash of disbelief in his eyes, and then that twitch at the corner of his mouth when his brain finally caught up to what his eyes were seeing. Jack noticed it too, of course he did. He turned his head, locked eyes with Daniel, and I saw it, clear as day recognition, followed by something darker. Not anger, not surprise, but something closer to satisfaction. "Well," Jack said casually, tilting his head ever so slightly, "didn't think we'd meet again, huh?" Daniel's face turned the color of curdled milk. His lips parted, then closed again like he couldn't decide whether to speak or run. Vanessa looked between the two of them, confusion giving way to panic, her fingers still clinging to Daniel's arm like she could somehow pull him out of whatever storm was suddenly blowing straight toward them. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Jack knew exactly what he was doing, and I had no intention of interrupting the show. Because this wasn't just some reunion. This was the turning of a wheel that had been in motion long before either of them realized it. See, what Vanessa didn't know, what Daniel thought he'd buried years ago, was that Jack wasn't just my husband. He was Daniel's ex-business partner. Not a casual acquaintance, not some forgettable contact from an old venture, but the man Daniel had backstabbed during a corporate deal that should have made them both filthy rich. Instead, Daniel had funneled profits through a shell company, forged documents, and walked away with millions while Jack was left cleaning up the fallout. At the time, Jack had taken the hit quietly, no lawsuits, no public drama, just disappeared from the company and let the world think he'd simply lost his edge. But what Daniel didn't know was that Jack didn't disappear because he was weak. He disappeared because he was patient. By the time I met him, Jack had rebuilt everything Daniel thought he'd destroyed bigger, better, smarter. He'd created his own empire in the shadows, investing in the right places, striking deals behind closed doors, always staying one step ahead. And when I told him my story, my betrayal, my family, my sister's smug little victory, he didn't flinch. He just listened quietly, nodded once, and said, "Interesting. I know that name." I hadn't planned on falling in love with Jack. Hell, I hadn't planned on trusting anyone ever again. But there was something in the way he saw through people, in the way he never rushed to judge, in the way he respected my silence without trying to fill it. And somewhere along the way, our plans, mine for healing, his for justice, became something more than strategy. So no, our marriage wasn't random. It wasn't a fairy tale or a revenge fantasy dressed in a wedding gown. It was real. It was rooted in fire and forged in understanding. And the fact that it made Vanessa's skin crawl was just a bonus. The funeral service ended with murmured prayers and fake tears, but I barely heard any of it. I was too busy watching Vanessa try to keep her composure while Jack stood beside me like a storm in a tailored suit. She didn't know what was coming next, not yet, but the cracks were already showing. And something told me Daniel felt it too, because he hadn't stopped staring at Jack since the moment he walked in. The past was catching up, and it wasn't knocking softly, it was kicking the damn door off its hinges. And this? This was only the beginning. There's a strange kind of beauty in watching a mask slip, especially when it's been worn so tightly for so many years that the person underneath forgot who they actually were without it. The funeral service had barely ended when the cracks started to show, first small and almost imperceptible, like hairline fractures on glass that only become obvious once the whole thing begins to shatter. Vanessa was trying, I'll give her that, smiling politely, greeting distant relatives, dabbing her eyes at just the right moments like she was auditioning for the role of grieving daughter, but beneath all that calculated grace, the panic was starting to bleed through. I could see it in her hands, the way her fingers wouldn't stop fidgeting, her thumb rubbing a raw spot on the inside of her wrist like she was trying to rub away a feeling she didn't want to acknowledge. Jack stood beside me the whole time, saying very little, just watching the room with those sharp, unreadable eyes of his. Every now and then, someone would come up and offer a hand or a shallow compliment about how well I looked after all these years, but their eyes always drifted toward Jack, curiosity practically dripping from their faces. And I didn't need to say a word. I just let the silence do the work. Because silence, when used right, can be the loudest thing in the room. The moment it really began to unravel came during the reception at my mother's house. The air was heavy with perfume and casserole steam, and the walls echoed with forced laughter and the low hum of uncomfortable conversations. Vanessa had barely touched her plate, though she kept picking at it like if she just rearranged the food enough times, she could avoid thinking about anything else. But the thing about guilt, real, unshakable guilt, is that it doesn't care about appearances. It grows loud in the quiet moments, demanding attention when you least want it. I heard it first in a whisper, a small murmur that passed from one corner of the room to another, a name spoken too softly to be polite, Jack's name, And then a second later, a sharper whisper, Daniel. Then someone asked Jack where he worked now, and he answered simply, casually, as if it were nothing, I'm in private investment. I manage acquisitions for a few select portfolios. He said it like it was boring, like it was nothing special, but the way Daniel's face tightened told me he heard exactly what wasn't being said. Jack didn't need to explain. The implication was more than enough. And then, just as smoothly, he dropped the bomb. Someone nearby asked how long he'd known Daniel. Jack sipped his drink, smiled slightly, and said, Oh, years ago. We used to run a company together. Until things got complicated. I got burned for a few million, learned my lesson, started again. The words were delivered so casually, so disarmingly, that it took a full 3 seconds for the room to register what had just been said. Even then, Jack didn't look at Daniel, he looked at me. And I smiled, slow and small, like I'd just remembered a funny story from childhood. Vanessa's head snapped toward Daniel so fast, I thought she might give herself whiplash. Her eyes were wide, questioning, demanding an explanation he couldn't give fast enough. I watched her mouth the word millions, like it didn't belong in her vocabulary. And that's when I saw it, her mask, the perfect, polished image she'd spent years curating, beginning to crumble right there in front of everyone. Her voice rose slightly, too sharp for the room, as she asked him, What is he talking about, Daniel? What millions? Daniel tried to brush it off, muttering something about business deals and exaggeration, but it was too late. The seed had been planted, and in a family like mine, one that thrived on gossip and appearance, that seed would grow fast and wild. Relatives started whispering, subtle glances exchanged, and the once silent judgment that had always been reserved for me began shifting toward them. And I just stood there, hands folded, saying nothing. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to scream. I didn't even need to raise my voice. I just let them fall apart piece by piece while I watched. That was the power I'd waited for all these years, not revenge through violence or cruelty, but through clarity, through quiet truth that no one could deny once it had been spoken aloud. Vanessa came to me later, her voice lower, her tone more desperate than I'd ever heard it. Her face was tight with fury and fear, but her words still tried to cling to control. Why didn't you ever say you were married? She asked, eyes darting toward Jack in the distance like she was trying to measure him again, trying to make sense of everything too fast. I looked at her, calm and deliberate, and said the one sentence I'd been waiting 15 years to speak, the sentence that was more than just a line, it was a lifetime distilled into 10 quiet words. You stole my fiancé. I stole your future. Her lips parted, but nothing came out at first. Then she said, almost like a reflex, Wait, what do you mean stole? And I smiled, not the kind of smile that invites conversation, but the kind that says the next chapter has already begun, and she's just now realizing she's not the one writing it anymore. Some endings don't come with fireworks or screaming matches or shattering plates on kitchen floors. Sometimes, the most devastating truths are dropped in soft tones, wrapped in politeness, and delivered with the kind of smile that leaves the room colder than a slap ever could. That's the thing people never really understand about revenge. It doesn't need to be loud to be complete. Sometimes it's more satisfying when it's served in whispers and silence, in unanswered questions and unraveling consequences that keep echoing long after the room has gone quiet. Vanessa stood there, blinking rapidly, trying to process what I'd just said, her mouth slightly parted like her brain couldn't decide if it wanted to scream or crumble. Her questions still hung between us like smoke. What do you mean stole? But I didn't rush to answer it. There's a kind of power in making someone sit in their confusion, especially when that confusion is the prelude to collapse. The truth was simple, and yet it carried the weight of 15 long years behind it. Jack and I weren't legally married, not yet. We hadn't signed papers or walked down some aisle with flower petals and polite claps from distant relatives. What we had was stronger than ceremony. What we had was deliberate, strategic, measured, and most importantly, real. It wasn't built on impulse or appearances or shallow status the way Vanessa and Daniel's marriage had been. It was built on trust, built on respect and, yes, built on a mutual understanding that life had handed us pain and we weren't going to waste it on bitterness alone. We weren't married, but we were partners in every way that mattered, and not just emotionally. See, Jack hadn't just climbed back from the financial wreckage Daniel left behind all those years ago. He'd built something so much bigger than even I realized when we first met. His investment firm, the one he spoke about so casually, had become a quiet giant in the corporate world, a shadow empire that moved money, bought power, and controlled decisions in boardrooms Daniel couldn't even get into anymore. Jack had spent years studying the markets, watching the moves Daniel made, biding his time until the perfect opportunity presented itself. And that opportunity had finally arrived, just 2 weeks before the funeral. Daniel's company, bloated and poorly managed, was ripe for collapse. It was bleeding money, hemorrhaging clients, and flailing under the weight of its own arrogance. Jack didn't even have to try that hard. A few well-placed offers, a few key shareholders persuaded, and suddenly, the company Daniel had once stolen from Jack became Jack's again, but this time entirely. A hostile takeover executed so smoothly, Daniel never saw it coming until the ink was dry and the doors were already closing around him. I didn't have to lift a finger. I didn't scream at Vanessa. I didn't curse at Daniel. I didn't rant or sob or throw glassware into walls like the heroine in some cheap soap opera. I just stood there, at my mother's funeral, holding the hand of the man who'd taken back everything Daniel stole, and more. I let them see what real power looked like when it didn't have to shout to be heard. I let them watch the empire they built on deceit slowly dissolve beneath their feet while I remained absolutely, perfectly still. And Vanessa? She realized the truth in slow motion, like watching a car crash from the other side of a glass wall, helpless, horrified, and too late to change anything. Her husband wasn't the powerful businessman she'd always paraded like a prize pony. He was a fraud, a failure, a man so desperate to stay on top he didn't notice the ground had been cut out from under him. I watched her spiral, watched the questions swarm behind her eyes like hornets in a jar, watched her try to piece together how everything had gone so wrong without her even noticing the warning signs. Her confidence drained out of her with every awkward glance from family members who now whispered about her instead of me. Her foundation cracked, and there was no speech, no insult, no sharp little dig she could use to climb out of the hole she was sinking into. I didn't feel triumphant, not in the way you might expect. I didn't feel vindicated in a blaze of glory. I felt calm. I felt full. I felt finished. Because this wasn't about proving I was better. It was about proving that I survived, that I rebuilt, that I rose without their help, without their approval, without lowering myself to their level. Maybe I went too far. Maybe I should have walked away years ago and let karma handle it on its own. Maybe. But then again, maybe some debts don't get settled until you make damn sure the scales are balanced yourself. Maybe justice isn't always clean or kind or poetic. Maybe sometimes justice wears a tailored suit and says nothing at all, just waits for the perfect moment to walk through a door and watch the air go still. Some people say revenge is bitter. Maybe. But sometimes it's just justice. Cold, calculated, beautiful justice. What would you have done if you were me?